Hello Hunters, just a heads up, this is the second part of a multi-part series. If you haven't watched the first yet, then maybe give that a gander first. If you don't want to, that's fine too, you can do whatever you want. With that in mind, welcome back to Super Fan Natural. Hunters, I've got 2 words for you. I don't know about you guys, but personally, I was enthralled with Supernatural's interpretation of death the first time I saw him. I mean, can you blame me? He's just so fascinating, and not just because of Julian Riching's amazing performance. No, what makes him really interesting is his role in the larger universe. As his name suggests, he is the force of death incarnate. Anytime a character is dealt a killing blow, be it by external forces or just time itself, it's this guy's touch that ultimately ends their life and ejects their soul so it can be ushered into the next stage of existence by his assistants, the Reapers. He felt so much bigger than anything else in the show, especially when he revealed that he was as old or older than God, the creator of life and the universe. If that's all the info we got on him, it'd be interesting, if not a bit confusing. However, the series would eventually introduce God's twin sister, the Darkness, who is definitely the same age as God. Now this still wouldn't necessarily contradict Death's claim, except when Amara was released back into the universe, she tells Dean that she doesn't know who Death is. She could be lying, but why? What would that accomplish? It's also worth noting that, like God, Death isn't an only child. There are at least 3 other beings who claim to be his brothers, they being War, Famine, and Pestilence, and together with Big D, they are the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. We don't really get any info about how they're related, all we know is that each have a fancy ring that's somehow tied to their powers. Death also carries another accessory, his scythe, which, say it with me now, we don't know much about. What we do know is that if you use the scythe against Death, it can kill him. Yet even Death can die, and he did. Now this kills Death the character, but it doesn't stop people from dying. And actually, the next Reaper that gets got will inherit Death's position, complete with ring, scythe, and powers. So then what even is Death? A person? A force? A position? And what about the Reapers that serve him? Where do they come from? At one point the show implies that they're angels, but they definitely aren't. They have a ghostly true form, and they don't seem to have wings, they can teleport after Season 8, and they're loyal to Death rather than Heaven. There's something else going on with them. For that matter, what about any of the Horsemen? Where do they come from, and where do they fit into the crazy cosmology? Well, spoilers, but the Horsemen are getting their own video, so they're not really going to be part of this one, except Death, of course. What is he? Where does he come from? Well, that's what I'm here to theorize. Buckle up, folks. This one's going to be something. In part 1 of this series, I gave my hypothesis as to where God and his sister came from. I would really suggest watching the first video because my ideas are a little complicated, but the short version is this. The original state of reality was one where nothing concrete existed, but there was an intrinsic potential baked into the fabric of nothingness. This potential wanted to manifest itself as something, but it couldn't decide between existing as one formless thing or a million different things. And eventually, this indecision caused both desires to manifest at the same time in the form of 2 sentient forces. One that's driven to create as many different things as possible, and one that's driven to destroy those things in order to keep things simple and unified. I'll admit it's kind of a weird, complicated theory, but we're trying to explain the very beginning of the beginning here. What you probably noticed is that I didn't include Death or the Horsemen anywhere in that blurb, and probably seems like there's no room for them to fit, which would mean that Death is definitely younger than God, right? This is a distinct possibility. After the events of Season 15, some fans have come to believe that Death is just another of God's creations, who was either given false memories of the beginning, or he just didn't remember the truth. This would fit with God's MO, as he's been known to lie to his children in order to make them feel more special than they are. It would also make sense considering that Supernatural contains a multiverse, and at least a few different universes have their own version of Death, whereas there seems to be only one God in Amara. P.S. I know that there are multiple marks of Cain. I'll make a separate video about that, but for now, all we know is that there seems to be one The Darkness. So that's it then? Everything we know about Death is a lie cooked up by Chuck? Could be, but I don't really believe that. See, Death has power over God that you don't really see from other creations. When we first met the OG Death, he claimed that one day he would reap God himself. That could have been a lie he was fed, except no it wasn't, because we see that not only can God die, he has a death book, meaning that as long as Death has existed, God's life has been finite. So then who wrote the book? Well, no one. According to Billy, the Reaper who became the second Death, the death books write and rewrite themselves. Okay, so what we really need to ask ourselves is if there's any authority that commands God, the darkness, and Death. And actually, there might be. If you pay attention, there's a term that comes up several times throughout the series, the natural order. We hear it a few times in the show, but whenever it comes up, it kind of just is used as vague reasons for why certain things have to happen. Why do certain people have to die at any given time? Natural order. Okay, but then why can't we just bring them back with one of the many methods of resurrection? Natural order. Okay, but then why? Natural order. Now shut up and stop asking questions. So yeah, they're basically a bunch of ill-defined rules that govern reality. We don't get a comprehensive list, but there are at least 2 rules we know that have actual consequences if they're broken. Firstly, everyone has a time to die. Sometimes there's a bit of wiggle room regarding when and how, but for the most part, when your time's up, and if someone doesn't go when they're supposed to, it can create a ripple effect that causes other people to die early. Now, you might think that God, the creator of life, would be an exception, but nope. Throughout the entire series, God is scheduled to croak eventually, and that actually brings me to the next big rule. When God goes, his twin sister, the darkness, has to go too. The twins both have to exist or not exist at the same time, and if one dies but not the other, then reality ends. So then who made up these rules? We don't know, they just are. I personally tie the natural order into my theory of reality's origin. I believe that when the twins came to be, their presence separated the incomprehensible chaos of pre-existence into 2 separate states of being, existence and non-existence. And because the twins manifested at the same time, they're both fundamental pillars of reality, so if one goes without the other, the whole thing comes crumbling apart. This rule is the basis of the natural order. No one created it, it just exists because of how existence came to exist. I bring all of this up because Death seems uniquely invested in the natural order. In fact, it's pretty much the only thing he seems to actually care about. One of the things that made OG Death so cool was that he couldn't give less of a shit about things that everyone else was freaking out about. The apocalypse, Godstiel's reign of terror, the angels getting booted from heaven, small potatoes to Big D. It doesn't matter if the universe is on fire, as long as people are dying when they're supposed to die, it doesn't really seem like his problem. Despite being a massive stickler for the ill-defined rules, he will occasionally bend them, but that's usually only if he personally has been manipulated or offended. Alright, enough prelude. What is Death and where did he come from? Now obviously we can't know for certain without some kind of official explanation, but I have come up with my own interpretation that I think works well enough. First, in order to explain death, we also need to explain death. The process of dying and what causes that. I believe that death is a fundamental property of reality that exists to counterbalance God's creative powers. I believe that within the very fabric of existence, there's an intrinsic will, a kind of survival instinct. Existence wants to keep existing, and you do that by respecting the natural order, and you do that by maintaining a balance between the forces of creation and destruction. Normally, this will doesn't actually have to do anything. The twins will naturally correct minor imbalances between themselves. However, when one of them gets locked up, then I believe that reality itself will change and introduce new properties to make up for the new imbalance. And since creation won out over destruction, we got a kind of mini-destruction. See, the thing you have to understand about God is that he doesn't just want to create inanimate objects. No, he seems to be driven to create living, sentient creatures that have their own little creative abilities. He wants to make things that can make things that he wouldn't have thought of, like nacho cheese. This might seem innocent enough. After all, it's not like he's giving them the same kind of power as God himself. However, at their core, they still possess a spark of divine power, and as we see in the actual show, a little bit of God power can go a long way. Now, obviously, God can destroy his creations if things start to get dicey. However, if you've seen part 1, then you know that I believe God's destruction power is limited. He can reduce his creations to a state that we would consider nothing. However, I don't think that he can snuff out the divine spark at their core. Only Amara can do that. Death doesn't create or destroy these sparks, but what it does do is drain the energy that holds them together and animates their form, gradually and constantly pulling out their life force and chemical energy, breaking them down until they're nothing left but a bare spark of divinity that then falls through the fabric of existence into the vast nothingness of non-existence, aka the empty. So then where does capital D death come from? Well, once God learned about death and realized that he had limited power over it, he decided to do the next best thing, negotiate with it. See, while I don't think that God created death with a lowercase d, I do believe that he's responsible for giving it a sentient incarnate form, and I think he did this using death's ring. By the way, I don't think that the ring is actually a ring. That's just a form it takes to blend in. I see the ring as something like a devil's trap, something that focuses and contains the essence of death into a coherent shape and organizes its behavior into a conscious mind. Thus, voila! Capital D Death is born. Sort of. See, just because this is the first time Big Daddy Reaper could think and speak and eat pizza in a way that we would recognize, it doesn't mean that this is the start of his existence. Think of him as a kind of vessel or avatar for Death the Force. It's still there, woven into the fabric of existence. Now it just has a form through which it can speak and act. That's why Death considers himself to be as old as God. As long as existence has existed, he's been there, a part of it, and even though he may not have manifested in a way that the God twins would recognize, it doesn't mean that he wasn't there. So God and Death chit-chat a bit, during which time God pretty much tells Death to stop what he's doing and just go away, to which Death responds, and I'm going to do my best Julian Richings impression here, "Nah, sorry G, can't do that." Nailed it. Obviously that's not the response God wanted, but it's one that he knew he might get, so he baked a few contingencies into Death's manifestation. First, he binds Death to try and compel him to do what he wants, and in response, Death materializes an object, an extension of his powers, a scythe capable of destroying his own form. Death explains that he's willing to destroy himself because he doesn't really need to exist in that shape. Death the phenomenon will still be there, regardless of whether or not it has a sentient avatar to act through. So, plan B. God made sure that Death's form would be bound to the universe in which it was created, so he creates a new, separate universe where hopefully Death will have no presence. However, while Death can't physically follow God out of the universe, Death, the existential property, is already there, because it's already everywhere, because it's a part of existence itself. So, out of ideas, Big G and Big D regroup for another chat, and this time they really talk and listen. God learns that Death isn't like the darkness. He doesn't have a problem with creation itself. He's just compelled to make sure that it respects the natural order so that existence doesn't collapse in on itself. Ultimately, he doesn't really care about the details of creation. All he cares about is the big picture, which boils down to a single rule. God's divine energy cannot accumulate forever. There has to be an order, a flow to things that prevents the kind of buildup that can lead to world-ending bugs and glitches. I believe this is at least partially what inspired God to set up creation the way he did, with Earth and biological life and nature and such. He created a system where his creations can resist Death's pull for a time by exchanging matter and energy between each other and the planet in a pretty self-sustaining cycle. Part of that sustainability comes from the fact that his creations are impermanent. They're relatively fragile, and they break down over time, and eventually, due to age or external damage, they can no longer retain their life force, allowing Death to fully yeet it from their bodies. It's a pretty good system, and God even got to fulfill his dream of making little mini-gods by giving his most favoritist creations spiritual supernovas called souls. Souls carry a lot of power, and they're kind of exactly what I believe Death was meant to prevent. In fact, one of the few times Death proactively helps the Winchesters is in response to Cass and Crowley trying to steal a buttload of souls from Purgatory. So God and Death come to an arrangement. Souls would get a life on Earth for a time, but after their body died, they would be pulled into another dimension called the Veil, which acts as a buffer between the worlds of the living and dead. From there, they would have the chance to be taken to one of several other dimensions designed to contain their power, and that's where Reapers come in. I believe that Reapers were a collaborative effort between God and Death. They are angel adjacent. God created them, but their inner essence comes from Death. It's an extension of him and the wider phenomenon that he embodies. Death tells Reapers what to do and where to go, then they're notified by God, and later Anubis, whether a soul goes up or down. By the way, I don't think Reapers take monsters to Purgatory. I'm pretty sure they just get automatically sucked there after death. If Reapers could get into Purgatory, they probably would have been targeted by Cass and Crowley during Season 6. Hey, Editing Jack here. Just wanted to clarify that I know Reapers can access Purgatory, I just don't think that they have the innate ability to travel to or send things there. That's why they have to find back doors to get in and out. But how does Death know where to send his creepy Reapies? You could say the Death books, but I've got a theory that could explain those. See, I don't think that the books have always existed, at least not in that form. I believe that the content of the books is information that just flows into Death's mind, and while the original model could handle all that info, I think it's possible that Billy was a little overwhelmed when she took over the position, which is understandable. So she manifested the information as books that update automatically as a way to manage the flow of information. If you've ever seen the movie Bruce Almighty, it's pretty much exactly like when Bruce converted prayers into files and sticky notes. This would also give a plot reason as to why Julian Riching's death had to die, because God's death book wouldn't exist as a physical object if a noob hadn't taken over the position. Speaking of Billy, I think a good way to wrap up this video is to discuss why Reapers can replace their boss. I believe that when Death dies, their essence doesn't go to the empty. Instead, they become one with the greater force of Death, like a Jedi in Star Wars. When this happens in the show, we see that the ring and scythe crumble away too. However, I don't believe that they follow Death into death. At least not the ring. Instead, it becomes immaterial as it searches for its owner's signature, and when it doesn't find it, the ring goes into a kind of standby mode. When a Reaper takes a fatal hit, the part of them that God provided gets vaporized, leaving just the pure death essence at their core, which then shares the same fate as their boss. However, if the ring is already in standby mode, then it'll detect this pocket of pure death and reform around it, thus creating a new Death incarnate. This new Death also gets their own scythe because, like I speculated earlier, the scythe is an extension of Death, so whenever someone takes over the mantle, they automatically generate a new one. Also, remember that I don't believe the ring or its wearer can leave their universe. I mean, we do see Billy go into the empty, but that's a little different. No, the reason why there are multiple deaths across the multiverse is because God either copy-pasted things he already had done, including making the ring and giving Death form, or he just made other rings. On a side note, I would absolutely pay a bunch of bucks to see multiple Julian Richings meeting around a table somewhere, eating junk food and gossiping about their respective universes. So that's how Death is replaced, but why does it happen? In this video, I've tried to drive home the point that Death doesn't need to have an incarnate form, so who set up this system of succession? There are a few possibilities, but I think the one that's most interesting is that it was an unintended consequence of God's actions. If you believe my theory, then pretty much everything about Death is a consequence of God upsetting the natural order by attempting to give himself more control over existence. He locks up his sister so he can be the only one in charge, and in turn, a new thing is introduced into the world that he can't reason with. He tries to gain control over it by giving it a form similar to his own, but in doing so he brought about an entity that could actively work against him. He tried to give himself power over Death's job by going halvesies on some minions for him, but that just set the stage for his new Primordial pal to be replaced if God ever tried to wipe him out. Everything Chuck did to gain control ended up setting the stage for his defeat. This mirrors what happened in the final season. He manipulates Team Free Will, thinking that he'll come out on top, but ends up creating the one thing that could defeat him. If the God Twins are cosmic forces that act upon existence, then Death is a reflection of and reaction to their actions. Okay, I think it's definitely time to lay this video to rest. I know, there's so much left unsaid. What about the other horsemen? Why can Death give away their ring? What's in God's death book? All topics for other videos. If you want to see them, then, do the stuff. Guys, I'm so close to 1,000 subs on this channel, and once we reach that goal, I'll give you a video about how I believe the cult works. You don't want to miss that, right? We'll get there, I know it. I'll see you on the other side, but until then, carry on.